In this video, we will uncover the elegance of the French defense with 3 standout games by the renowned Grandmaster Alexander Grischuk. The first opponent is Grandmaster Arthur Kogan. He starts e4 and Grischuk replies e6, the French defense. The French defense has a reputation for solidity and resilience. White often gets a space advantage on the king side, whereas black will counterattack on the queen side. Given the opportunity to claim the center, white pushes forth with d4. Black replies d5, immediately challenging white's central pawn duo. White's knight d2 supports the pawn without blocking the c-pawn. Grischuk is quick to strike with c5, aiming to exchange a flank pawn for a valuable central pawn. White proceeds with his development, bringing the knight to f3 to support the pawn. Black captures the pawn and white recaptures, centralizing the knight. Black's knight f6 develops while adding an attacker to the e4 pawn, so white releases the tension, capturing on d5, and black recaptures with the queen. White's tricky knight b5 looks for a royal fork on c7, which would win the queen. But black sees this, jumping the knight to a6 where it defends that square. Then white plays c4, attacking the queen and fighting for key central squares. Grischuk retreats the queen to c6 before white plays a3, preventing any black minor piece from jumping to b4 and preparing a potential queenside expansion. Black carries on with bishop e7, getting ready to castle, and white's knight hops to f3 where it has clearer vision of the center. Black castles and white develops the bishop to e2, preparing to do the same. Black's rook d8 puts the rook on the open file while attacking the enemy queen. After white shifts the queen out of harm's way to c2, black centralizes his knight from the rim to c5. This entices white to push forward with b4 attacking the knight. Grischuk does not want to just retreat into a passive position, so he finds a nice move. Queen e4, hitting the undefended queen. Now white doesn't really have much choice here, because black's knight d3 check would exploit the pin on the bishop to the king and force the king to go uncastled in the heat of a wild central position. So white exchanges queens, allowing black to recapture with the knight, getting it out of danger. White develops his bishop on the long diagonal, and black also develops his bishop before white castles. At this point, Grischuk initiates a plan to create weaknesses in white's position. He plays a5, threatening to capture twice on b4. White has no way to defend the pawn, so he captures on a5, and black recaptures, getting an open file for his rook and giving white 2 isolated pawns. White swings his rook over to fight for the open d-file, but this leaves his f2 pawn loose. Black immediately targets it with bishop c5 in coordination with the knight. White blocks the attack with bishop d4, but this takes one defender away from the a3 pawn. Grischuk captures the knight on b5, weakening the a3 pawn even further. White does not want to recapture because then black would take the pawn on a3, and if white were to take the bishop on c5, black would capture the rook first, pinning the rook to the king so that white wouldn't be able to capture on d8, and after white recaptures, only then would black recapture the bishop, leaving black a pawn up. So white captures the bishop on c5 instead, opening the rooks to one another. Black captures the rook and white recaptures, threatening a back rank check. But black recaptures the bishop, cleverly spotting that were white to give check, he could block with the bishop defended by the knight, leaving black a full piece up. So first white recaptures the bishop, now threatening back rank checkmate for real. Grischuk calmly shifts his king to f8, getting out of the checkmate threat. Now the pawn on a3 is under attack, and it's actually indefensible. Rook a1, for example, would be met with knight b3, and after rook a2, black would play knight c1, forking the bishop and the rook, and forcing the rook to move off the a file if it still wants to defend the bishop. White tries rook c1, attacking the knight, but black jumps his other knight forward to e4 to defend the knight, and the c3 square in case the rook wanted to go there to defend the a3 pawn. Here, white tries desperately to keep the game even with a sneaky trick. Knight g5. Black could take the knight, but it would hang his own knight and give white too much activity with his pieces. Grischuk keeps his cool and captures the pawn on a3, allowing white to capture the pawn on h7 with check. Black understands that the knight on h7 is not in a great spot, and white would have to set up a mighty escape mission for it to get out. White slides the king to e8 out of check, and black plays h4 so that his knight can return safely to g5. Black stops this getaway with f6. White swoops the bishop to h5 with check, and black moves the king to e7. Then white plays bishop g6, threatening to take the knight so that black would recapture with the other knight, allowing the white rook to invade the 7th rank. Grischuk finds knight c3, defended by the rook, and threatening knight e2, which would fork the king and rook. White moves the king out of the knight's sight, and black solidifies his other knight's post with b6. White continues his knight's rescue mission with g4, trying to break down the black pawn chain. But this creates gaps in white's king side, and black is quick to exploit them with knight e2 hitting the rook and targeting the vulnerable f4 square. White moves the rook to e1, counterattacking, and black's knight leaps to f4, attacking the bishop. Were white to retreat the bishop, then rook h3 would win a pawn. So white plays h5, defending the bishop. Grischuk moves his knight to d7, planning to maneuver it to continue an onslaught on the white king. In light of knight e5 double attacking the bishop, white preemptively retreats it all the way back to b1. Black plays knight e5 anyway, and this is the crushing blow, prompting white to resign. The threat is to play knight f3, forking the king and the rook. If the rook would move, doesn't matter to where, then there would be a neat checkmate, starting with rook h3, forcing the king to g1, followed by knight f3, which would force the king to f1, and the finisher, rook h1 checkmate. Moving the king to h1 would lead to the exact same checkmate as such. So the only other options would be sacrificing the exchange, which would be losing, or bishop e4 covering the f3 square, after which black would win 2 pawns, namely the one on g4 whose capture comes with check, followed by the one on h5. With adept maneuvering, Grischuk exploited the French defense's resilience, steering the game towards a winning endgame for black. The next opponent is Super Grandmaster Dmitry Jakovenko, and he meets the French defense by capturing the pawn on d5. Grischuk recaptures, and we are left with a more open and symmetrical position. White develops the knight to f3 and black the bishop to d6. Then white strikes at the center with c4. This offers black the opportunity to capture the pawn, creating a white isolated pawn. In exchange, white recaptures the pawn on c4, getting quick development and preparing to castle. Black's knight leaps to f3 before both sides castle. Both sides bring their second knights out, and both sides create luft for their kings, which also prevents the enemy bishops from going to g4 and g5, pinning the knights to the queens. After white's a3 giving space to the bishop, Grischuk finally ends this copycat chronicle with bishop f5 slicing through the white queen side. White centralizes his rook, and black plays a6, guarding b5 from enemy infiltration. White presses forward with d5, attacking the knight and gaining space. Black retreats the knight to e7, and white drops his bishop back to a2, where it's less prone to attack. Black centralizes his rook to e8 before white develops his final minor piece with bishop e3. Grischuk begins reactivating his knight, maneuvering it to g6. After white plays knight d4, attacking the bishop, black drops it back to d7, where it can still keep an eye on the white king side. White's queen d2 connects the rooks and creates a battery aimed at black's king side. Black's queen c8, in the same vein, stares down the white king's home. White plays f3 so that were black to sacrifice the bishop by taking twice on h3, then the white queen would cover black's checkmate threat on h2, and the queen would also be in time to rush over to g2 to defend any incoming attack. Grischuk, however, does not hesitate. His rook bursts out to e5, getting ready to swing over to bolster the attack. White stops that with g4, but this gives black all the more reason to push forward with h5, trying to break down the pawn chain. At this point, white's king no longer has a place on this side of the board, and king f1 is played, pursuing an escape. Black takes the pawn on g4. Now black is either going to take a second pawn, or if white plays f4 attacking the rook, black would swing it over to h5, which could be very troublesome. So white has no choice but to recapture the pawn, and it wouldn't matter which way he recaptures. In this case with the g-pawn, black's response is the same. Grischuk sacrifices the bishop on g4. After white recaptures, the black queen takes back the pawn, springing to life on g4. The king's escape is stopped, and black's pieces are primed to proceed with the attack. Black plays queen g2 in a desperate bid for survival, but this leaves the knight on d4 with one less defender. Black skillfully takes the bishop on e3, giving up the rook as white recaptures, but the defender of the knight on d4 has been removed. Black captures it with the queen, getting 2 pieces for the rook. White's rook is attacked, so he brings in the other rook, doubling them on the open e-file. Now, although material is even, with black having a knight and 2 pawns for the rook, white's king is in huge trouble, and Grischuk proves this right away. First, he brings the rook to f8 so that white can't push the rook to the back rank with check, thus freeing up the knight who is defending the e8 square to push forward. White doesn't have a defense for what is to come, and he plays bishop b1. Finally, black plays knight g4, and white, seeing his grim fate, resigns. What's going to happen is either white will have to give up the exchange, or move the rook, in which case black will inevitably win material. One such example is rook to h3, after which black would check with queen f6, and no matter what white would do, he would face serious problems. Blocking with the rook would result in knight h2, a fork. Moving the king to g1 would see bishop c5, followed by knight f2, another fork. Lastly, king to e2 would invite, worst of all, knight f4, a royal fork. Grischuk's precise play transformed the French defense's solidity into a crushing offensive, leaving white's position beyond repair. The final opponent is Grandmaster Bojan Vukovic, and he meets the French defense with knight c3 defending the e4 pawn. Grischuk pins the knight to the king with his bishop, threatening to take the pawn, which persuades white to push the pawn to e5, gaining space. Black immediately undermines white's advanced pawn with c5 attacking its defender. White counterattacks the bishop with a3, and black captures the knight, doubling white's pawns after he recaptures. Black develops the knight to e7, and then white immediately exploits black's lack of a dark squared bishop with queen g5 going after the weak g7 pawn. Grischuk does not defend the pawn, but captures the pawn on d4. Now white could take the pawn on g7, but after rook g8 counterattacking and queen takes h7, black would have counterplay with queen c7 attacking the e5 pawn and the pawn on c3, making the most out of white's lack of development. So instead, white proceeds activating his pieces with bishop d3. Black swoops the queen to a5, threatening queen takes c3 with the fork on the king and rook. Bishop d2 would not work because black would take the pawn on c3, attacking the bishop. White could defend with knight e2, but he chooses rook b1, allowing black to take the pawn with check. White sneakily shifts the king over to d1, weaving a subtle trap. Black's pawn on g7 is still undefended, and were black to castle to defend it, he would face serious repercussions. Rook b3 would be played, attacking the queen and forcing it to retreat. Then the spectacular sacrifice, bishop takes h7, would pave the way for the rook to storm in, once the king would recapture. After the king would move back to g8, queen h5 would line up a battery threatening checkmate. f6 would be black's only way to survive. White would check on h7, pushing the king to f7, after which he would take the pawn, attacking both the knight on e7 and the pawn on g7. The king would have to recapture, then rook f3 would skewer the king to the rook, so the knight would have to block, which would allow g4 attacking the pinned knight. And white can still carry on his attack given black's weak king position. Back to the game. That was one deep trap, and our meticulous expert Grischuk does not fall for it. But he still has to defend the pawn on g7, and he does so with king f8, losing the right to castle. So despite white being down 2 pawns, if he plays his cards right, he could build up a strong attack, whereas black will try to defend and convert his material advantage. White starts off by developing his knight to f3, and black plays b6, blunting the rook's semi-open b-file. White follows with queen h5, planning knight g5 with a devastating checkmate threat. In light of this, Grischuk plays h6, solidifying his kingside position. But white plays knight g5 anyways, exploiting the pin on the h-pawn to the rook. Black's g6 stops the checkmate threat and pushes the queen back to h4. Black retreats his queen to c7 in order to defend his king. And here white begins his sacrificial spree. He takes the pawn on f7, breaking down the foundation of black's kingside pawns. The king recaptures and the white queen jumps into f6 with check and an attack on the rook. The king goes to g8 to defend, and white plays the only move to keep the attack going, rook b3, with the plan of taking the pawn on g6 with the bishop, and after the knight would recapture, playing rook g3, pinning the knight to the king with a decisive attack to follow. Grischuk, cool under pressure, plays g5, and white keeps the haymakers coming with bishop takes g5, sacrificing a second piece. Black recaptures and white takes with the queen, giving check. The king sidesteps to f8, then white plays queen f6, forking the king and the rook. And were the king to go to g8, then white would unveil the extraordinary bishop h7. If the king would capture the bishop, then rook to h3 check would skewer the king to the rook, and once the king would return to g1, rook h8 would be checkmate. Otherwise, if the rook would capture, then white would play rook g3 check, and of course the rook cannot block because of checkmate, so the knight would have to be given up, and white would take it with the queen. Here, the rook blocking would lead to a swift checkmate in 2, and the queen blocking would lead to checkmate on the next move thanks to the pin on the queen to the king. So the only option would be to slide the king over, which would allow queen g8 check, followed by queen takes h7, and finally rook g8 checkmate. Back to the game. For this reason, Grischuk moves the king to e8, giving up his rook on h8 with check. The king dodges to d7. After all this, black has two pieces for a rook and a pawn, which is generally better for black, but in return, white does have a couple passed pawns, which means the game could still go either way. White carries on with bishop b5 check, and black blocks by developing his knight from b to c6. Now black will develop the bishop to b7, opening up an attack on the queen, so white preemptively moves the queen out of the way to f6. Black plays a6, forcing white to make a decision, and he captures the knight on c6. Grischuk recaptures with the queen before white starts pushing his pawn forward with h4. Black pushes a5, opening up a more active square for his bishop. Then white plays queen f4, attacking the pawn on d4. So black defends it with queen c5. Now white's best plan is to invest in his most valuable asset by pushing his passed h-pawn. Instead, he moves his king up to d2, making way for the rook to join its partner in attacking black's b-pawn. But this is a mistake because now black has more time to build up an attack, and the king is blocking the queen from retreating to defend the attack. After black develops his bishop, white plays rook h to b8, doubling up on the b-pawn. Black counterattacks with rook c8, creating a more urgent threat of taking on c2 with check. So white plays rook 1 to b2 to defend. Grischuk lifts his rook to c6, patiently defending his own pawn, and white admits his mistake by moving the king back to d1, making way for the queen to retreat if necessary. Black pushes a4, attacking the rook, and white decides to move it to f3 to defend the f-pawn, which was indirectly attacked by the queen. Next, black pushes d3, trying to break open the c-file, allowing the queen to infiltrate on the back rank. But this opens up the fourth rank, and the white queen gobbles the pawn on a4. Black's queen jumps to c3, attacking the rook, so white drops the queen to b3, defending, and trying to get a queen exchange with his king under so much pressure. Grischuk does not budge, grabbing the pawn on c2 with check. The queen recaptures before black unveils the wondrous bishop e2 check. If the queen takes the bishop, then queen c1 would be checkmate. And if the king moves to c1, then queen e1 would be checkmate, thanks to the pin on the queen to the king. So white is forced to take the bishop with the king. This allows black to take the pawn on e4 with the queen, giving check, and opening the rook's gaze against the enemy queen. White has no way of saving his queen, and black will take it on the next move. For that reason, white decides that now is good a time as any to resign. The game concluded with Grischuk's French defense not just holding firm but turning aggressive, dismantling White's position move by move. I hope these games were both entertaining and instructive. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.